The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic, rhythmic drone against the humid Iowa air of June 1972. It was the sound of fortunes changing hands, of dreams being sold off by the pound. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my hands tucked into the pockets of my worn denim overalls, feeling the familiar grit of field dust under my fingernails. My name is Jack Callahan, and I was there not to buy a dream, but to pick through the wreckage of one. Old Man Hemlock had finally given up the ghost, and his kids from the city wanted nothing to do with the farm but the cash it would bring. They were selling everything, right down to the last rusty bolt in the coffee can on his workbench. Most of the good equipment had already gone for top dollar. The crowd was buzzing, fueled by high corn prices and the government telling us to plant fence row to fence row. Credit was cheap, and ambition was running hotter than a 2-cylinder Johnny Popper on a July afternoon. That's when I saw him. Richard Miller, or Rich, as he insisted everyone call him. He was holding court near the front, wearing a crisp new seed corn cap that hadn't seen a drop of sweat. He'd just bought Hemlock's nearly new John Deere 4320 for a price that made my stomach clench. He was 10 years my junior, but he farmed 3 times the ground I did, all of it on the bank's money. He saw farming not as a way of life, but as a numbers game, a leveraged portfolio of soil and steel. He caught my eye and sauntered over, a smug grin plastered on his face. "See anything you can afford, Jack?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the men around us to hear. "Maybe a nice shovel? Or a set of post-hole diggers?" A few of his buddies chuckled. I just gave him a slow nod, my gaze drifting past him to the back line, the place where the auctioneer sent the true junk, the stuff that was one step away from the scrapyard. And there it was. It was a monster, a relic from a brief, glorious era of farm machinery. A Massey Ferguson 60 combine. It was one of the biggest machines of its day when it rolled out of the factory a few years back, but this one looked like it had been through a war. The sheet metal was dented and faded to a pale, rusty pink. One of the huge rear tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old boot. A thick layer of grime and bird droppings covered every surface. Taped to the dusty windshield was a piece of cardboard, with one word scrawled in greasy black marker: scrap. Miller followed my gaze and let out a short, barking laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. That old beast? Hemlock bought it new, ran it hard for 2 seasons, and then the main bearing on the cylinder went. Dealer told him it had cost a fortune to fix. It's been sitting behind his barn, rotting, for the last 3 years. The engine's probably seized solid." I didn't say anything. I just started walking toward it, the dry grass crunching under my work boots. The sheer size of it was something to behold. It was built like a battleship. The grain head, a 20-foot rigid platform, was detached and lying beside it like a fallen shield. I ran my hand along the cold, pitted steel of the auger. I could smell the decay, the scent of mouse nests, rust, and stagnant, oily water. Miller and his crew followed me, like crows circling a dying animal. "What are you going to do, Jack?" he sneered. "Try and patch it up with baling wire and prayer? You ought to just buy my old 6600. I'm trading it in on a new 7700 next month. Turbo diesel, air-conditioned cab, hydrostatic drive. It's the future." I ignored him. I climbed the ladder to the operator's platform. The seat was torn, the foam guts spilling out. The gauges were clouded, the glass cracked on the tachometer. But the levers felt solid in my hand. The steering column was firm. This machine was built heavy. Not like the new stuff, with its thin sheet metal and plastic components. This was American iron, forged in a time when things were meant to last and meant to be fixed. I knew its heart was a Perkins V8 diesel, a 5-10 cubic inch monster. Temperamental, they said, but powerful. If it wasn't seized, if the block wasn't cracked, it was a long shot. A damn long shot. The auctioneer was moving down the line. All right, folks, what else we got here? A few old ploughs, a disc, and this, he said, gesturing dismissively at the Massey. Lot number 347. Massey Ferguson 760 combine, for salvage or parts. Engine condition unknown. Sold as is. Where is? We're selling it for scrap weight, folks. Let's start the bidding at the scrap price. Who'll give me $200? Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves of the cottonwood trees. $200 was the price of a decent welder. 200, anyone? Come on now. The tires are worth that, if you can get 'em patched. Miller laughed again. Go on, Jack. It's calling your name. A piece of junk for a junk farmer. Something in me hardened at that. My father's voice echoed in my head, a lesson he'd drilled into me since I was old enough to hold a wrench. Son, he'd say, there are two types of farmers. Those who work for the bank and those who work for themselves. Never forget which one you want to be. My farm was small, just 320 acres my grandfather had homesteaded, but it was mine. The deed was in the safe deposit box at the bank, not the loan officer's file cabinet. My tractors were old. A Farmall M, my dad bought new, in '49, and a John Deere 4010. I'd bought for cash 5 years ago. But they were mine. Every nut, every bolt. 200, I said, my voice quiet but clear. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, surprised. I got 200 from Mr. Callahan. Do I hear 250? 225? The crowd just stared at me. Miller shook his head in mock pity. No one else was stupid enough to bid on a multi-ton paperweight. Sold, the auctioneer barked, slamming his gavel down on his notepad. For $200 to the man with more time than sense. The laughter that followed stung more than I'd let on. As Miller walked away, he clapped me on the shoulder. You send me an invitation to the funeral, you hear? I'd love to see you bury that thing. I just watched him go, then turned back to my prize. The Titan, I thought. That's what I'll call it. It looked like something forgotten by a race of giants, and I was going to bring it back to life. But before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Watching me stand there, with that mountain of scrap iron, and the whole county thinking I was a fool, who would you have bet on? The man with the brand new, bank-funded fleet, or the man with the $200 pile of junk and a promise to himself? Drop a comment below and tell me what you think, because the answer says a lot about what you believe in. Getting the Titan home was the first battle in a long war. It took 2 days, a borrowed lowboy trailer, and every chain I owned. We had to use my 40-10 and my neighbor's Oliver 1850 just to winch the main body of the combine onto the trailer. The groan of the steel and the straining of the tractor engines was a sound I'll never forget. When we finally got it into my yard, it looked even bigger and more hopeless than it had at the auction. It squatted next to my machine shed like a beached whale, casting a long, intimidating shadow over my modest operation. Sarah, my wife, came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She had a look on her face that was a mixture of concern and weary resignation. She'd seen me drag home lost causes before, but nothing on this scale. "Jack," she said softly, "what in God's name is that?" "That, my love," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt, "is our ticket to staying free. It's a Massey 760. It looks like it lost a fight with a freight train," she replied, her eyes scanning the rust and the flat tires. "How much did you pay for it?" $200. She was quiet for a moment. I could see the gears turning in her head, calculating the hours, the cost of parts, the sheer impossibility of it all. But Sarah was a farm girl, born and raised. She understood the language of machinery and hard work. She also understood me. "Well," she sighed, forcing a small smile, "I guess you'd better get your wrenches." And so it began. The rest of that summer, and into the fall, the Titan became my obsession. I started with the heart of the beast, the Perkins V8. I spent a week just cleaning away the caked-on grease and dirt, the mouse nests, and the shed corn that had sprouted and died inside the engine bay. I drained the oil, and it came out like black sludge. A bad sign. The radiator was full of rust-colored water. Another bad sign. I pulled the heads first. The bolts were rusted solid. I soaked them in penetrating oil for 2 days, tapping them with a ball-peen hammer every few hours to break the rust's grip. Finally, using a 3-foot breaker bar with a piece of pipe on the end for leverage, I felt the first one give with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet afternoon. One by one they came loose. When I lifted the first cylinder head off, my heart sank. The cylinder walls were streaked with rust. Water had gotten in through a leaky head gasket and sat there for years. Miller's words echoed in my ears. Engines probably seized solid. I put a socket on the main crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine and fitted the breaker bar. I pulled. Nothing. I put my whole weight into it. The bar bent slightly, but the engine didn't move a millimeter. It was seized, solid as a rock. Any sane man would have given up right there. Called the scrapyard, collected his $200, and admitted defeat. But I'm not always a sane man. I'm a Callahan. My grandfather broke this prairie with a team of mules, and my father survived the Dust Bowl. Quitting wasn't in the blood. I spent the next week carefully disassembling the engine. I rigged a chain hoist to the big oak tree next to the shed and pulled the V8 out of the combine's chassis. I got it onto an engine stand in my workshop, a space that smelled of motor oil, welding fumes and freshly cut steel. That workshop was my sanctuary. It held my Lincoln Tombstone arc welder, my drill press, my lathe, and generations of tools my father and grandfather had used. Their sweat was still on the wooden handles. I filled the cylinders with a 50-50 mix of acetone and automatic transmission fluid, a concoction old-timers swore by for breaking loose seized pistons. I let it soak for days. Every morning, I'd try the breaker bar. Nothing. Every evening, I'd try again. Still nothing. The talk at the co-op was merciless. I'd become the town fool, the laughing stock. Heard Jack Callahan's trying to unseize that old Massey engine, they'd say over coffee. Might as well try to teach a pig to sing. Finally, on the 5th day, I put the bar on the crank and gave it a heave. I felt a tiny movement. It was almost imperceptible, like the earth shifting a fraction of an inch. But it was there. Hope surged through me. I worked the bar back and forth, slowly, patiently, for hours. A 1/16 of an inch each way, then an 1/8, then a 1/4. With a final groaning screech of metal on metal, the crankshaft made a full rotation. It was free. The pistons were scored, the rings were shot, and the cylinder walls would need to be bored out. It needed a full rebuild. I spent the winter sourcing parts. I drove to 3 different states, visiting farm equipment graveyards. I found a Perkins V8 out of a burned-out white tractor in a junkyard in Nebraska that had a good crankshaft. I pulled the cylinder liners from a Massey Ferguson 1150 tractor in Kansas. I ordered new bearings and a gasket set from a supplier in England, waiting 6 weeks for them to arrive by mail. Piece by piece, I rebuilt that engine on the stand in my shop. I honed the cylinders. I measured the bearing clearances with plastigauge. I torqued the head bolts in the precise sequence the worn, oil-stained shop manual dictated. By the time the first spring thaw came, I had a fully rebuilt, repainted Perkins V8 engine, gleaming in Massey Ferguson red, hanging from the chain hoist, ready to be put back in its home. The day I finally turned the key, and that big diesel roared to life, coughing out years of rust and dust in a cloud of black smoke before settling into a deep, rumbling idle, was one of the proudest days of my life. Sarah came running out of the house with a smile that lit up the entire farm. We had won the first battle, but the war for the Titan was far from over. The engine was just the beginning. The entire machine was a mechanical puzzle with 1,000 missing pieces. The hydraulic system was a nightmare. Hoses were cracked and brittle, and the main pump was shot. I couldn't afford a new one, so I took the old one apart on my workbench. It was a complex piston pump, and a key valve was scored beyond repair. I spent 2 days on my metal lathe, turning a new valve from a piece of hardened steel stock. It took 4 attempts to get the tolerances just right, measuring with my micrometer down to the 1,000th of an inch. The threshing cylinder, the part that had caused Old Man Hemlock to abandon the combine in the first place, was the next major hurdle. The main bearing had disintegrated, and in the process, it had chewed up the shaft and the housing. The dealer hadn't been lying. It was a catastrophic failure. I pulled the whole massive assembly out, a cylinder nearly 5 feet wide, covered in rasp bars. I welded up the damaged shaft and spent a full day turning it back down to its original diameter on the lathe, checking my work constantly. I had to fabricate a new bearing housing out of 1/4-inch plate steel, cutting it with a torch and grinding it to shape. Every repair was a testament to patience. I replaced dozens of belts, patched holes in the sheet metal with fiberglass, and rewired the entire electrical system, which had been thoroughly chewed by mice. I taught myself how to rebuild the carburetor-sized injectors for the diesel engine. I learned more about hydraulic flow rates and gear ratios than I ever thought I would. My hands were permanently stained with grease, my knuckles were always busted open, and my muscles ached with a deep, satisfying fatigue every night. Meanwhile, the world of farming was moving on without me. The year was now 1974. Corn was over $3 a bushel, an unheard-of price. The Great Grain Robbery, when the Soviets bought up a huge portion of the U.S. grain supply, had sent prices to the moon. Land values were soaring, and Rich Miller was riding the wave like a champion. He had bought that new John Deere 7700, and then another one the next year. He'd traded his 4320 for a brand new 4630, with a sound guard cab that was quieter than most cars. He bought the 160 acres to the east of me, and then the half section to my north. He was farming over 1,000 acres now. Every time he drove by my place in his new Cadillac, he'd slow down, look at the Titan still sitting in my yard in various states of disassembly, and just shake his head with a smirk. The talk at the diner was all about his success. "Did you see Miller's new planter?" they'd ask. 16 rows. Can plant 100 acres before lunch. My 8-row John Deere planter felt like a child's toy by comparison. The pressure to conform, to borrow, to expand was immense. The local banker, Mr. Henderson, even paid me a visit. "Jack," he said, leaning against the fender of his Buick, "the bank is offering some very attractive operating loans right now. With prices like these, you could easily expand. Buy that quarter section south of you. We could get you into a new combine, something reliable." He glanced over at the Titan. "You're a good farmer, Jack, but you can't compete with yesterday's tools." I thanked him for the offer and politely declined. "I prefer to sleep at night, Mr. Henderson," I told him. and I sleep best when I don't owe anybody anything." He left looking at me like I was a fossil. In a way, he was right. I was becoming a relic, a holdout from a bygone era. My philosophy of debt-free farming, passed down from my father, was now seen as a weakness, a lack of vision. Miller was the new model, aggressive, leveraged, and winning. By the harvest of 75, I was finally ready. 2.5 years of nights and weekends, of busted knuckles and busted budgets, had led to this moment. The Titan was whole again. I had replaced the rotten tires with a good used set from a salvage yard. I had painted over the worst of the rust with Massey Ferguson red paint, applied with a brush. It wasn't pretty. It was covered in weld marks, patches, and mismatched parts. But it was strong. I climbed into the cab, the same torn seat I'd sat in at the auction. I turned the key. The big Perkins V8 coughed to life, settling into its familiar, thunderous idle. I engaged the separator, and the whole machine began to vibrate and hum, a symphony of belts, chains, and gears. I pulled the hydrostatic lever forward, and the giant machine lurched into motion. I drove it out to my first field of corn. It was a beautiful sight, the stalks tall and golden in the autumn sun. As I lowered the 20-foot grain head, I saw Miller's operation starting up on the horizon. His 2 big, green John Deeres were working in tandem, moving fast, gobbling up corn at an incredible rate, their clean cabs and powerful halogen lights looking like spaceships in the dusk. Here I was, in my loud, rattling, open station relic. But as the corn stalks began to feed into the header, as the kernels began to rattle into the grain tank, I felt a deep sense of pride. This machine, this Titan, was mine. Every single part of it had been earned with my own sweat and ingenuity. It owed nothing to the bank, and neither did I. For the next few years, that was the pattern. The boom continued. Grain prices stayed high, land values kept climbing. Miller became a local legend. He bought more land, bigger equipment. He built a massive new machine shed and grain drying facility that dwarfed my entire farmstead. He was featured in a farm magazine as a pro-farmer of the future. In the article, he talked about leverage and cash flow and economies of scale. He took vacations to Hawaii, while I spent my winters rebuilding the transmission on my 40-10. I stuck to my plan. I farmed my 320 acres. The Titan, despite its age, was a reliable workhorse. It was slow and it broke down occasionally, but I knew every inch of it. I could fix anything that went wrong with the tools in my own shop. The money I made went into 3 places: paying off the last of my farm's mortgage, building up a healthy savings account, and slowly improving my operation with good, used equipment I could buy for cash. I was profitable. I was secure. But in the eyes of the community, I was a failure. I was the man who could have been a king but chose to remain a peasant. At the co-op one fall afternoon in 1979, Miller cornered me by the feed sacks. He was beaming, full of self-importance. "Jack, old boy," he said, slapping me on the back. "I just closed on the Henderson farm, another 300 acres. The bank couldn't have been more helpful. Interest rates are a little high, but with corn heading for $4, you can't lose." The prime interest rate, the number I heard on the radio every morning, had just ticked past 15%. It sent a shiver down my spine. "That's a lot of debt to be taking on, Rich," I said quietly. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that turned heads. "You got to spend money to make money, Jack. It's the name of the game. You and that old junk pile of yours. You're stuck in the past. You're playing checkers while the rest of us are playing chess." He walked away, leaving me there in the dust-filled air. I looked out the big bay doors of the co-op, across the fields to the horizon. Dark clouds were gathering in the west. Not rain clouds. Something else. I could feel it in my bones, the same way my grandfather could feel a blizzard coming. A change was on the wind. The easy money, the high prices, the endless optimism. It felt fragile, like a pane of glass just waiting for the right stone to be thrown. And I had a sinking feeling that the stone had just been launched from Washington, and the man playing chess had no idea it was heading right for him. The change I'd felt coming on the wind arrived not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, chilling frost. It began in the winter of 1980 with the news of the grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The announcer on the radio delivered the news with patriotic fervor, but every farmer listening knew what it really meant. One of our biggest customers had just been cut off. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $4 a bushel, faltered. It dropped 10 cents, then 20. By spring planting, it was struggling to stay above $3. That summer, a drought settled over Iowa like a suffocating blanket. The sky turned a hazy metallic gray, and the sun beat down with a relentless, punishing heat. The corn in my fields, which usually stood tall and proud by July, was stunted, the leaves curling inward during the day as the plants desperately tried to conserve moisture. I watched my potential yield wither on the stalk. It was the same for everyone. The difference was what it cost to put that crop in the ground. One sweltering afternoon in August, I was replacing a worn-out sickle bar on my old John Deere haybine when Rich Miller's pickup truck came barreling down my lane, kicking up a plume of thick dust. It wasn't his Cadillac. It was his farm truck, and it skidded to a stop near my shop. He jumped out, his face flushed and streaked with sweat. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, wired energy. "Jack, you got a heavy-duty gear puller? A big one?" he asked, not even bothering with a hello. "Might have," I said slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. "What's the trouble?" "It's the 7720, he snapped, running a hand through his hair. "The main separator drive gearbox. Something let go inside. It's grinding like a coffee can full of rocks. I got 200 acres of beans that are ready to pop right out of the pods, and that damn thing is dead in the water." The John Deere 7720 was his newest toy, bought just last year. It had replaced one of his 7700s. It was a technological marvel, bristling with sensors and electronics. "Dealer can't get to it for a week," he continued, pacing back and forth, "and they want a fortune just to look at it. I figure if I can get the main pulley off the shaft, I can at least see what's broken." I walked into my shop and came back with a heavy, three-jawed puller, its main bolt thick as my wrist. "This ought to do it," I said, handing it to him. He snatched it from my hand. "Thanks," he muttered, already turning back to his truck. "I'll get it back to you." He paused for a second and looked at my parched cornfields, then back at me. "This drought, the prices, it's a hell of a squeeze, isn't it?" It was the first time he had ever spoken to me as an equal, as a fellow farmer facing the same enemy. "It is," I agreed. "A man's got to watch his costs." He just grunted, a flicker of the old resentment in his eyes, and sped away. I learned later that it wasn't a simple bearing. A specialized electronic clutch pack inside the gearbox had failed. The part had to be ordered from the factory in Moline, and it cost over $2,000. His combine sat idle for 10 days while his soybeans baked in the fields. He lost a good portion of that crop. That was the first crack. The new, complex machines were incredibly productive when they ran. But when they broke, they were dead weights. You couldn't just fabricate a part on a lathe or bypass a faulty switch. You were at the mercy of the dealer, the supply chain, and the corporate price list. My Titan, on the other hand, kept chugging along. When a chain broke on the cornhead, I drove to the parts store, bought 10 feet of standard roller chain, and had it fixed in an hour. When a hydraulic line burst, I cut a new one from a bulk roll I kept in the shop and crimped the ends myself. The cost was minimal. The downtime was short. My harvest that year was poor, but I got every last bushel of it into the bin. The squeeze Miller had talked about was becoming a stranglehold. The Federal Reserve, trying to kill inflation, kept raising interest rates. By 1981, the prime rate was over 20%. 20%. It was an impossible number. Anyone who had borrowed money saw their payments balloon into monstrous sums. Operating loans that were manageable at 8% became bankrupting at 20%. The conversations at the co-op changed. The talk of expansion and new equipment died out, replaced by hushed, worried whispers about interest payments and letters from the bank. Men who had been proud and loud now stared into their coffee cups, their faces etched with a fear I recognized. It was the fear of losing everything. Miller's empire, built on the sand of cheap credit, began to crumble. He was land-rich but cash-poor. The payments on his thousands of acres and his fleet of new equipment were relentless. He started selling off assets. First, it was a few parcels of land, the ones furthest from his home base. He had to sell them at a loss because land values were starting to fall as fast as they had risen. No one was buying. Then he started selling equipment. A big 4-wheel drive versatile tractor disappeared from his yard one day, then one of his big planters. He was trying to stop the bleeding, but it was like trying to patch a dam with chewing gum. The pressure of the debt was too great. The bank, which had been his partner in prosperity, was now his executioner. Mr. Henderson, the banker, no longer drove out to farms to offer loans. He drove out to deliver ultimatums. The winter of 1982 was bleak and cold. The price of corn had fallen to nearly $2 a bushel, less than what it cost most guys to grow it. Foreclosure notices started appearing in the local paper like obituaries. Good families, families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years, were being forced out. The auctioneer's chant, once the sound of optimism, was now a funeral dirge. I survived by retreating into my shell. Sarah and I lived off our savings. We ate from the massive garden she planted every year. We butchered our own hogs. We cut our own firewood to heat the house. We bought nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. My farm was an island of solvency in a sea of red ink. I had no debt. My land was paid for. My equipment was my own. The low prices hurt, but they couldn't break me. I wasn't making a profit, but I wasn't losing the farm either. The day of Rich Miller's auction was grey and cold, a miserable Saturday in March of 1984. A bitter wind whipped across the yard, carrying with it the smell of defeat. The crowd was different from the one at Hemlock's auction all those years ago. It was smaller, more subdued. There were no dreamers here, only vultures and ghosts. The farmers who came were not looking to expand. They were looking for bargains, for parts to keep their own aging machines running. The rest were just neighbors, bearing silent witness to the end of an era. I saw Miller standing near the porch of his big, custom-built house, the one he'd taken that vacation to Hawaii to design. He looked like a stranger in his own life. His face was pale and drawn. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He was 10 years younger than me, but on that day he looked 20 years older. His entire operation was lined up in neat, tragic rows. The massive John Deere 7720 combine, the 4630 and 4840 tractors with their comfortable Soundguard cabs, the 16-row planter. It was the dream fleet of the 1970s, now looking like extravagant relics of a foolish time. The auctioneer started the bidding, his voice lacking its usual fire. The prices were brutal. The 7720, which Miller had paid over $100,000 for just a few years earlier, sold for $30,000. The big tractors went for a third of their original price. No one was bidding against the bank representatives, who were there to protect the bank's investment by buying the equipment back at rock-bottom prices. It was a bloodbath. I didn't bid on anything. I was just there to watch, to understand. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of, "I told you so." All I felt was a profound sadness for him, for his family, for all the families caught in this terrible machine of finance and false promises. He had played the game by the rules he was given, and the rules had changed on him in the middle of the fourth quarter. The last thing to be sold was the land. The auctioneer sold it off, parcel by parcel. The Henderson farm he'd bought, the quarter section north of me. All of it went for less than half of what he'd paid. Finally, they came to his original homestead, the 160 acres his own father had farmed, the place where he had grown up. He stood there, watching his birthright being sold off, and I saw his shoulders slump. He looked utterly broken. The bidding was slow. The banker started it at $600 an acre. Another neighbor bid $650. I thought of Miller's sneering face at that first auction, his mockery of my old combine. I thought of his booming laugh at the co-op when he called me a fool for playing checkers. And then I thought of my father's words, "Never forget which one you want to be." I raised my hand. "700, I said. A hush fell over the small crowd. All eyes turned to me. The banker, Mr. Henderson, looked surprised. He conferred with his colleague, then nodded. The other bidder shook his head and stepped back. $700 an acre, going once, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing in the cold air. Going twice. He looked at Miller, who was just staring at the ground. Sold, he said, his gavel falling with a soft, final thud. To Jack Callahan. I had bought my neighbor's home. A few weeks later, after the papers were all signed, I drove over to Miller's place. The yard was empty. The big machine shed stood open and vacant like a hollowed-out carcass. He and his wife were packing the last of their personal belongings into a U-Haul truck. They were moving to town, to a small rental house. He was going to try and get a job at the local factory. He saw my truck pull in and stiffened. He walked over, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. Come to take possession, Jack? He asked, his voice rough. No, Rich, I said, getting out of the truck. I came to talk. We stood there in the wind for a long moment. I don't want your pity, he said. It's not pity, I replied. It's respect. You're a good farmer, Rich. You just got caught in a bad time. He finally looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I was a fool, a greedy fool. I thought I was so smart. Leverage, cash flow. They were just fancy words for gambling. And I lost it all. You haven't lost it all, I said. I pulled a piece of paper from my shirt pocket. It was a lease agreement I'd had the lawyer draw up. I bought your home place, not the other land, just this quarter section, the house, the barns. He stared at me, confused. I want to rent it to you, I continued, for $1 a year. You and your family can stay here. You can work the home quarter. You can use my equipment until you get back on your feet. The planter, the cultivator, even the Titan if you want. He looked at the paper, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing. He couldn't speak. Why? He finally choked out. After everything. Why would you do this for me? I looked out across the fields, the same fields his father and my father had looked out on. Because this is our home, I said quietly. All of us. We're neighbors. and neighbors help each other. That's a currency the banks don't understand. He took the paper from my hand, his own hand shaking. He unfolded it and read it, and then he leaned against the fender of my truck and wept. He cried for his lost empire, for his pride, for the future that had been stolen from him. And I just stood there with him, a hand on his shoulder, until he was done. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The 1980s were lean years, but we survived. Rich and I became unlikely partners. He was a phenomenal agronomist, and he worked the home quarter with a renewed passion, a humility he'd never had before. I handled the mechanical side of things. We shared equipment, shared labor, and shared the risk. The community, which had once idolized his ambition and mocked my caution, slowly began to change its perspective. My workshop became a gathering place. Men would stop by with a broken part from a baler or a tractor, and I'd help them weld it or machine a new piece. They couldn't afford dealer prices, so they learned, as I had, to be self-sufficient. The old ways, the skills of making and mending, were valuable again. My son, David, grew up in that world. He didn't know the boom times. He knew the value of $1 and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. He spent his childhood in my shop, learning how to turn a wrench, how to read a wiring diagram, how to listen to an engine and diagnose its troubles by sound alone. He loved the Titan. To him, it wasn't a piece of junk. It was a legend. It was the machine that had weathered the storm. One sunny afternoon, in the late fall of 1989, David, now a strapping teenager with my father's eyes, was helping me get the combine ready for winter storage. The harvest was done, another modest but profitable one in the books. Rich had had a good year too, and had even managed to buy back another 80 acres adjoining his homestead. The farm economy was slowly, painfully, healing itself. We were greasing the final fittings on the Titan. It looked its age now. The paint was faded, the sheet metal was scarred with 100 repairs, but it ran as well as it ever had. "Dad," David said, looking up at the massive machine, "why did you keep this old thing all these years? We could afford a newer one now, one with a cab and air conditioning." I stopped turning the grease gun and looked at him. I thought back to that auction day, to the laughter, to Miller's smug face. I thought of the years of work, the busted knuckles, the cold nights in the shop. I thought of the quiet pride I felt every time that big Perkins V8 rumbled to life. "This combine," I said, running my hand over a fender I had welded myself, "is more than just a piece of iron. It's a lesson. It taught me that the things you truly own are the things you can fix yourself. It taught me that real wealth isn't about having the newest and the shiniest. It's about being free. Free from the bank, free from the opinions of others, free to live your life on your own terms." I pointed to the name I had stenciled on the side of the grain tank years ago, now faded but still legible. The Titan. "It's not just a machine, son," I said, putting my arm around his shoulders. "It's a promise that no matter how bad the storm gets, we'll still be standing when it's over, because our roots go deep, and we don't owe anybody a damn thing." He looked from the old combine to me, and in his eyes I saw that he understood. He understood the legacy of the land, the weight of the tools in our hands, and the quiet dignity of a life built not on credit, but on character. The auctioneer's chant had long since faded, but the real work, the work of holding on to what truly matters, was just beginning for the next generation. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that it was in good hands.